Picture yourself standing in the narrow stone streets of Jerusalem on a Sunday morning in the 1st century. The air is electric with anticipation. A man approaches the city gates, riding on a young donkey, and the crowd around him has erupted into absolute celebration. Palm branches are flying through the air, cloaks are being thrown onto the dusty road, and the words echoing off the ancient walls are the sacred words of Psalm 118. Words that every Jewish person would instantly recognize as messianic language. This man is being welcomed as the long-awaited king, descended from the house of David. Now hold that image in your mind for a moment, because exactly 5 days later, you are standing on those same stone streets. The same city walls surround you. Many of the same faces are in the crowd. But this time, that man's back has been torn open by Roman whips. He is staggering under the weight of a wooden crossbeam, and those same voices that shouted Hosanna are now screaming, "Crucify him." How does everything flip so completely in just 120 hours? Stay with me, because the answer to that question is not just fascinating history. It is the very center of the Christian faith. And by the end of this video, you will understand that Jesus was never a victim of circumstances spinning out of control. He was the sovereign author of a rescue mission, planned before the foundation of the world. Before we walk through these 7 days step by step, we need to establish something foundational. Holy Week is not primarily a story about political corruption, religious hypocrisy, or human failure, even though all of those realities are clearly present throughout the narrative. At its deepest level, Holy Week is the historical unfolding of an eternal plan. 1 Peter 1:20 tells us that Christ was chosen before the creation of the world. The events of Passion Week were not divine emergency responses to an unexpected crisis. They were the precise execution of a rescue mission designed in eternity and revealed in time. This understanding completely transforms how we read the timeline, because when you recognize that God was sovereignly orchestrating every betrayal, every trial, every nail, the story stops being a tragedy and starts being a triumph. But there is more. Each individual day of Holy Week carries its own specific theological weight and prophetic significance. Miss any single day, and you miss something essential about who Jesus is and what he came to accomplish. However, what many people do not realize is that the key to understanding the entire week is recognizing that Jesus was never reacting to events. He was directing them. The week opens on Sunday with what we traditionally call the triumphal entry. Jesus descends the Mount of Olives toward Jerusalem, deliberately choosing to ride on a young donkey that had never been ridden before. This detail is not incidental. It is a massive, highly visible, prophetic declaration. Approximately 500 years earlier, the prophet Zechariah had written these exact words in chapter 9, verse 9. "Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Jesus was not simply selecting convenient transportation. He was publicly and deliberately fulfilling a specific messianic prophecy before thousands of witnesses who could not later claim they misunderstood his identity. The crowd's response proves they understood the symbolism perfectly. They waved palm branches and shouted words taken directly from Psalm 118, 25 through 26. Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. These were not generic expressions of enthusiasm. They were theological declarations with clear messianic implications. Pause here, because this detail matters. The tension that will define the entire week is already visible on Sunday. The crowd welcomed a king, but they had very specific expectations about what kind of king he would be. They wanted a military liberator who would drive out Rome and restore Israel to political supremacy. What they were about to receive was something infinitely greater and completely different from their expectations. And that gap between human expectation and divine reality is what makes the events of the next 6 days both devastating and glorious. After entering Jerusalem to enormous public acclaim, Jesus did something that Mark's Gospel records with understated but profound significance. Mark 11:11 tells us that he went to the temple and looked around at everything. He did not teach. He did not perform miracles. He did not confront anyone. He simply observed. This act of deliberate assessment was itself deeply significant. Jesus was not preparing to react impulsively to what he saw. He was surveying the spiritual condition of the most sacred space in Israel, with the eyes of a king who knew exactly what he would do the following morning. Then, because it was already late, he withdrew with his disciples to Bethany, a village approximately 2 miles east of Jerusalem, on the far side of the Mount of Olives. What many people do not realize is that this pattern of seeing, waiting, and acting with perfect timing characterizes every day of Holy Week. Jesus moved with sovereign purpose, never rushed, never surprised, always in complete control of the narrative. On Monday morning, as Jesus and his disciples traveled from Bethany back toward Jerusalem, they encountered a fig tree in full leaf. Jesus approached it looking for fruit, but found nothing except leaves. And he spoke a word of judgment over it that would be fulfilled within 24 hours. This moment often puzzles modern readers. Why would Jesus curse a tree for not bearing fruit, when Mark's Gospel explicitly states it was not the season for figs? The answer becomes clear when you understand the fig tree's symbolic role throughout Hebrew prophetic literature. Jeremiah 8:13, Hosea 9:10, and Micah 7:1 all use fig imagery to represent Israel's failure to produce the fruit of genuine covenant faithfulness, despite impressive outward religious activity. The fig tree with abundant leaves but no fruit was a living prophetic sign. It represented the exact spiritual condition Jesus was about to address directly in the temple courts. Immediately after the incident with the fig tree, Jesus entered the temple and demonstrated what his kingship actually looked like. He drove out those who were buying and selling, overturned the tables of the money changers, and refused to allow the temple courts to be used as a marketplace or a shortcut for foot traffic. As he cleared the area, he quoted 2 prophetic texts in combination. From Isaiah 5:6-7, "My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations." And from Jeremiah 7:11, "But you have made it a den of robbers." This was not an emotional outburst. It was a calculated demonstration of royal authority. The king who had entered Jerusalem on Sunday was now purifying the most sacred space in the nation on Monday. He was showing that Israel's deepest crisis was not political occupation by Rome. It was spiritual corruption in the house of God. The connection between the fig tree and the temple cleansing is unmistakable. Both revealed the same devastating reality. Impressive religious form without genuine spiritual substance. But there is more, because Mark 11:18 tells us that from this moment forward, the chief priests and the scribes began actively seeking a way to destroy him. The king's purification of his father's house had signed his own death warrant. Tuesday of Holy Week was arguably the most intellectually intense single day of Jesus' entire public ministry. When Jesus and his disciples passed the fig tree again on their return to Jerusalem, they discovered it had withered completely from its roots overnight. Peter pointed this out with apparent amazement, and Jesus used the moment to teach about faith, prayer, and the authority of God's word. Then Jesus entered the temple courts, and the intellectual warfare began in earnest. First came the chief priests and elders, challenging his authority directly. "By what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you this authority?" Jesus responded with a counter-question about John the Baptist's authority that exposed their political cowardice and left them unable to answer. Next came an unusual alliance of Pharisees and Herodians, groups who normally despised each other, but were united by their shared desire to trap Jesus. They asked about paying taxes to Caesar, a question carefully crafted to force him into either political sedition against Rome or religious compromise before the people. Jesus asked for a denarius, identified whose image was stamped on it, and delivered one of the most memorable responses in all of Scripture. Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. The Sadducees followed with a theological trap about resurrection. The teachers of the law came with questions about the greatest commandment. In every single confrontation, Jesus responded with wisdom, authority, and insight that left his opponents with nothing to say. Matthew 22:46 records the final outcome. No one could say a word in reply, and from that day on, no one dared to ask him any more questions. What many people do not realize is that Tuesday was not a day of defensive survival for Jesus. It was a day of sovereign demonstration. He was not a cornered victim. He was a king holding court, systematically exposing the intellectual and spiritual bankruptcy of every human system that dared to challenge his authority. After the confrontations in the temple courts, Jesus and his disciples left the city and sat on the Mount of Olives. From that elevated position, they had a clear view of the magnificent temple complex spread out below them. And it was there that the disciples asked the question that prompted one of the most significant prophetic teachings in all of Scripture. Matthew 243. Tell us, when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? What followed is known as the Olivet Discourse. Jesus addressed the coming destruction of Jerusalem, the tribulations that would characterize the present age, the signs of his return, and the final consummation of all things. He warned against false messiahs and false prophets. He described wars, famines, and earthquakes as birth pains rather than final events. He called his followers to watchfulness, faithfulness, and readiness. But here is what is theologically crucial about this teaching. Jesus was not providing a prophetic code for calculating end times events. He was providing a framework for faithful living in an uncertain world. He was saying history will be turbulent, opposition will be real, suffering will come, but none of it falls outside the sovereign plan of God, and those who endure to the end will be saved. The Olivet Discourse was delivered on the same day that Jesus had publicly dismantled every intellectual challenge his opponents could mount. The message was coherent. Human systems of power and religion will ultimately fail, but God's purposes will ultimately prevail. Wednesday of Holy Week presents us with what many scholars call Silent Wednesday. Unlike the other days of the week, the Gospels record no public ministry activity by Jesus on Wednesday. The most natural reading suggests that he spent this day in quiet retreat in Bethany, likely at the home of his close friends Lazarus, Martha, and Mary. But while Jesus rested, Jerusalem was anything but quiet. Matthew 263-5 records that the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered secretly in the palace of Caiaphas the high priest to plot Jesus' death. Their primary concern was timing. They explicitly agreed, not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people. And it was on this day that Judas Iscariot made his fateful decision. Matthew 26:14-16 tells us that Judas went to the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?" They counted out 30 pieces of silver. The historical and archaeological record gives us important context here. 30 pieces of silver was the legally prescribed compensation for a slave accidentally killed under Mosaic law, as recorded in Exodus 21:32. The religious authorities were effectively pricing the Son of God at the value of a dead slave. However, what many people do not realize is that Wednesday also contains a beautiful counter-narrative. Both Matthew and Mark, in describing Judas's betrayal, place it immediately alongside the account of a woman who anointed Jesus with expensive perfume from an alabaster jar. When the disciples protested the apparent waste, Jesus defended her act, saying she had prepared his body for burial, and that her deed would be remembered wherever the gospel was proclaimed. The contrast is stark and intentional. One person calculated the maximum value she could surrender to honor Jesus. Another calculated the minimum price for which he could surrender Jesus himself. By Thursday, Holy Week enters its most theologically dense and emotionally intense phase. Jesus sent 2 disciples ahead to Jerusalem with specific instructions for preparing the Passover meal. And their mission was fulfilled exactly as he had described. The Passover was not merely cultural background for what was about to happen. It was the theological framework that gave Jesus' death its precise meaning. For 14 centuries, the Passover had commemorated Israel's deliverance from Egypt, the blood of the lamb marking the doorposts, the angel of judgment passing over the protected houses, the beginning of a new life as a redeemed people. On Thursday evening, in an upper room in Jerusalem, Jesus revealed that every element of the Passover had been pointing to him. During the meal, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and said, according to Luke 22:19, "This is my body, given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Then he took the cup and declared in Luke 22:20, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." The theological weight of these words cannot be overstated. Jesus was declaring that the entire sacrificial system of the Old Covenant, every lamb slain on every altar, every drop of blood shed in the temple, had been a shadow pointing to this moment. He was the true Passover lamb, whose body would be broken and whose blood would be poured out to establish the new covenant between God and his people. But Thursday evening contained several other moments of extraordinary significance. Jesus washed his disciples' feet, assuming the role of the lowest household servant. He predicted his betrayal and identified Judas, who immediately left into the night. He comforted the remaining 11 with words recorded in John chapters 14 through 17, including promises of the Holy Spirit and his own return. After the supper, Jesus and the 11 remaining disciples crossed the Kidron Valley and entered a garden called Gethsemane on the lower slopes of the Mount of Olives. It was apparently a place Jesus visited regularly, which explains how Judas knew exactly where to find him. What happened in Gethsemane is one of the most theologically significant passages in the entire New Testament, and it reveals the full reality of Christ's humanity with startling clarity. Matthew 26:37 through 38 records that Jesus took Peter, James, and John deeper into the garden and began to be sorrowful and troubled. He told them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." Then he fell face down and prayed. Luke 22:44 adds a detail that carries enormous medical significance. Jesus' sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. This describes a rare but documented condition called hematidrosis, in which extreme psychological stress causes blood vessels in the sweat glands to rupture. It is not metaphorical language. It is a clinical description of a human body under almost unimaginable pressure. Gethsemane shows us that the obedience of Jesus was not effortless or mechanical. It was costly, agonizing, and genuinely human. He prayed 3 times. "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." Here, more than anywhere else, we see the theological significance of Christ's full humanity. Where the first Adam failed in a garden of abundance with no external pressure, the last Adam succeeded in a garden of agony, with every human instinct crying out for escape. Then Judas arrived with the soldiers, and the final sequence began. The arrest was made with a kiss, the ultimate perversion of intimacy, transformed into betrayal. The disciples scattered in terror, and Jesus was dragged through a series of hearings and trials that violated every principle of ancient and modern justice. He was first brought before Annas, the former high priest who retained enormous behind-the-scenes influence. Then he was taken to Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin for a formal night session that violated Jewish legal traditions, requiring daylight trials and waiting periods between verdict and execution. False witnesses were brought forward, but their testimonies contradicted each other. Finally, Caiaphas asked Jesus directly, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" Jesus answered with language from Daniel 7:13 and Psalm 11:01, declaring that they would see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. The high priest tore his clothes, declared the words blasphemous, and the council condemned Jesus to death. Meanwhile, Peter, who had boldly promised loyalty just hours earlier, denied knowing Jesus 3 times when challenged by servants in the courtyard. At daybreak, Jesus was taken to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. Because Judea was a Roman province, the Jewish authorities lacked the legal right to carry out capital punishment. So the charge was deliberately reframed from blasphemy, which meant nothing to Roman law, to sedition and treason against Caesar. Pilate interrogated Jesus personally, found no basis for conviction, and declared him innocent. When he learned that Jesus was from Galilee, he sent him to Herod Antipas, who happened to be in Jerusalem for Passover. Herod wanted to see a miracle, but Jesus remained silent. After mockery and humiliation, he was returned to Pilate. Pilate then offered to release one prisoner according to a Passover custom, presenting the crowd with a choice between Jesus and Barabbas, a man imprisoned for insurrection and murder. The crowd, influenced by the religious leaders, chose Barabbas. And Pilate, in an act of supreme political cowardice, handed an innocent man over to crucifixion to preserve his own position. After brutal flogging that was itself often fatal, Jesus was mocked with a crown of thorns and a purple robe, then led to a place called Golgotha, meaning place of the skull. Mark 15:25 tells us that the crucifixion began at the 3rd hour, approximately 9 in the morning. Jesus was nailed to the cross between 2 criminals. The charge above his head read, "King of the Jews." Those who passed by mocked him. Religious leaders sneered. Even one of the criminals crucified alongside him joined in the mockery. At the 6th hour, noon, supernatural darkness covered the land. At the 9th hour, 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in the words of Psalm 221, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Then he declared, "It is finished," and yielded his spirit. Immediately, Matthew 27:51 through 54 records extraordinary supernatural events. The temple curtain was torn from top to bottom. The earth shook, rocks split, and tombs were opened. A Roman centurion, witnessing these signs, declared that Jesus was truly the Son of God. But we must understand what the cross accomplished in theological terms. The Bible presents it first and foremost as substitutionary atonement. 2 Corinthians 5:21 states, "God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God." Isaiah 5:35 had prophesied centuries earlier, "He was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him." At the cross, God did not overlook human sin. He judged it fully in the person of his own Son, the substitute he himself provided. The tearing of the temple curtain from top to bottom symbolized the removal of the barrier between God and humanity, opening access to the holy presence through the blood of the perfect high priest. Jesus' body was hurriedly placed in a new tomb donated by Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin who had not consented to the council's decision. Nicodemus assisted with the burial, bringing approximately 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes, according to John 19:39. Then came Saturday, the day of silence and apparent defeat. For the disciples, it was a day of shattered hope. The one they had believed was the Messiah was dead. The movement they had sacrificed everything to follow appeared to be over. Meanwhile, the religious authorities took additional precautions. Matthew 27:62 through 66 records that they went to Pilate and requested a guard for the tomb, citing Jesus' own prediction that he would rise after 3 days. The tomb was sealed, and soldiers were posted. But Saturday was not the end of the story. It was the pause before the final word. God sometimes accomplishes his most decisive work in moments when everything appears motionless. The silence of Saturday was not the silence of defeat, but of preparation. However, what many people do not realize is that the stone sealing the tomb was not keeping something in. It was about to demonstrate that what had been inside was no longer there. In the early hours of Sunday morning, Matthew 2:82-4 records that a violent earthquake occurred. An angel of the Lord descended from heaven, rolled back the stone, and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, his clothes white as snow, and the guards shook with fear and became like dead men. The women who came to complete the burial preparations found the stone already rolled away and the tomb empty. An angel told them, "He is not here. He has risen, just as he said." The response of the religious authorities is itself a form of evidence. Rather than producing the body, which would have immediately ended any resurrection claim, they bribed the guards to spread the story that the disciples had stolen it while they slept. The fabricated explanation was self-defeating, since sleeping guards cannot testify to events that occurred while they were unconscious. But the resurrection was established not primarily by the empty tomb, but by the appearances of the risen Christ. Over the following 40 days, Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene, to other women, to Peter individually, to 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus, to the 11 in the upper room, to more than 500 people at one time, according to 1 Corinthians 1:56, and finally, to Paul himself. The resurrection was God's public declaration that the sacrifice was accepted, that death had been conquered, and that the one crucified as a criminal was vindicated as the Son of God. Romans 14 tells us that Jesus was appointed the Son of God in power by his resurrection from the dead. Now we can step back and see Holy Week as a unified, purposeful whole. Every single day was necessary. Every event was meaningful. Nothing was accidental. Sunday's triumphal entry was necessary because it publicly established Jesus as the Messianic King before witnesses who could never claim they misunderstood his identity. Monday's temple cleansing was necessary because it demonstrated that the Messiah's mission was spiritual purification, not political liberation. Tuesday's confrontations were necessary because they exposed the intellectual and moral bankruptcy of human religious systems, before the cross revealed what true authority looked like. Wednesday's silence was necessary because it showed that even in apparent divine inactivity, God's plan was advancing precisely on schedule. Thursday's supper was necessary because it provided the interpretive framework for understanding the cross as covenant sacrifice. Gethsemane was necessary because it proved that Jesus' obedience was genuine, costly, and freely chosen, rather than effortless or predetermined. Friday's trials were necessary because they revealed that the rejection of Jesus was not the failure of one particular group, but the manifestation of universal human sinfulness. The crucifixion was necessary because it was the moment toward which all of history had been moving. Saturday's silence was necessary because it confirmed that the death was real, not apparent. And Sunday's resurrection was necessary because it was God's final, authoritative interpretation of everything that had preceded it. So we return to where we began, with a crowd on Sunday shouting words of hope, and a crowd on Friday shouting words of condemnation. The question Holy Week forces us to confront is not which historical group we identify with, but which crowd we are in spiritually. Is Jesus the king of your life in ways that actually cost you something? Or is he the king you celebrate when the atmosphere is exciting, but abandon when following him becomes difficult? Holy Week confronts us with the gap between the faith we claim and the faith we practice. It shows us Peter, who genuinely loved Jesus and genuinely denied him in the same night. It shows us disciples who had witnessed every miracle, yet scattered when pressure came. But it also shows us that the answer to our failure is not greater personal effort. The answer is the cross itself. The same cross that exposed human weakness provides the only sufficient remedy for it. 3 questions to carry with you this week. First, what does it mean for you personally that Jesus chose the cross rather than being forced onto it? Second, where in your own life do you see religious form without genuine fruit? Third, what would it look like to live this week in the light of an empty tomb rather than under the shadow of sealed circumstances? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to know which part of this timeline spoke most powerfully to your heart. And if this video helped you see Holy Week with new eyes, share it with someone who needs to understand what that week was really about.